The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 2. Along with these multiple intellectual interests went an unerring sense for the practical. Following Domitian's lead, Hadrian reduced his freedmen to subordinate functions, chose businessmen of tried ability to administer the government, and formed from them and senators and jurists a concilium to meet in regular sessions for the consideration of policies. He appointed an advocatus fisci, or attorney for the treasury, to detect corruption or deceit in the payment of taxes, with the illuminating result that while taxes remained as before, revenues were decidedly increased. He himself kept watch on each department and, like Napoleon, astonished its heads by detailed knowledge of their field. His memory was vast, says Spartianus. He wrote, dictated, listened, and conversed with his friends all at the same time, though the frequency of this tale invites suspicion. Under his care and with the help of an extended civil service, the empire was probably better governed than ever before or afterward. The price of this zealous order was a swelling bureaucracy and a mania of regulation that moved the Principate still closer to absolute monarchy. Hadrian observed all the forms of cooperation with the Senate. Nevertheless, his appointees and their executive orders encroached more and more upon the functions of what had once seemed an assembly of kings. He was too close to his problems to foresee that his efficient but proliferating bureaucracy might become in time an unbearable burden upon the taxpayers. On the contrary, he believed that within the framework of law and ordinance which his government had established, every person in the empire would find career open to talent, and any man could rise rapidly from class to class. His clear and logical mind resented the chaos of accumulated, obscure, and contradictory laws. He commissioned Julianus to coordinate the enactments of past praetors into a perpetual edict, and encouraged further codifications that paved the way for Justinian. He acted as a supreme court, both in Rome and on his journeys, and earned the reputation of a fair and learned judge, always as lenient as the reign of law would permit. He issued innumerable decrees, usually in favor of the weak against the strong, the slave against the master, the small farmer against the large estate, the tenant against the landlord, the consumer against the deception of retailers and the multiplication of middlemen. He rejected accusations for maiestas, refused bequests from parents or persons unknown to him, and ordered a tolerant application of the laws against Christians. By his own example on state lands, he encouraged the practice of emphatusis, or implanting, by which owners rented rough acres to tenants to be planted with orchards and remain rent-free till fruit grew. He was not a radical reformer. He was only a superlative administrator, seeking, within the limits and inequalities of human nature, the greatest good of the whole. He preserved old forms, but he quietly poured new content into them according to the needs of the time. Once, when his passion for administration flagged, he refused audience to a petitioning woman with the plea, "I haven't time." "Don't be emperor, then," she cried. He granted her a hearing. 2. The Wanderer. Unlike his predecessors, Hadrian was as interested in the empire as in the capital. Following the wholesome precedent of Augustus, he decided to visit every province, examining its conditions and needs and alleviating them with the expedition and resources available to an emperor. He was curious, too, about the ways and arts, dress and beliefs of the diverse peoples in his realm. He wished to see the famous places of Greek history, to steep himself in that Hellenic culture which was the background and adornment of his mind. He loved, says Fronto, not only to govern but to perambulate the world. In 121 he set out from Rome, accompanied not by the pomp and trappings of royalty, but by experts, architects, builders, engineers, and artists. He went first to Gaul and came to the relief of all the communities with various acts of generosity. He passed into Germany and astonished everyone by the thoroughness with which he inspected the defenses of the empire against its future destroyers. He reorganized, extended, and improved the limes between the Rhine and the Danube. A man of peace, he knew the arts of war and was resolved that his pacific temper should neither weaken his armies nor misguide his enemies. He issued severe regulations to maintain military discipline and obeyed these rules while visiting the camps. There he lived the life of the soldiers, eating their fare, never using a vehicle, walking with full equipment 20 miles on a march, and showing such endurance that no one could have guessed that he was at heart a scholar and a philosopher. At the same time, he rewarded excellence, raised the legal and economic status of the legionaries, gave them better weapons and ample supplies, and relaxed the discipline of their free hours, merely insisting that their amusements should not unfit them for their tasks. The Roman army was never in better condition than in his reign. He now traveled down the Rhine to its mouth and sailed across to Britain, this in 122. We are not informed of his activities there, except that he ordered a wall built from the Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne to divide the barbarians from the Romans. Returning to Gaul, he passed leisurely through Avignon, Nîmes, and other towns of the Provincia, and settled down for the winter at Tarragona in northern Spain. While he was strolling alone in the gardens of his host, a slave rushed upon him with drawn sword and tried to kill him. Hadrian overpowered him and quietly handed him over to the servants, who found that he was insane. In the spring of 123, he led some legions against the Moors of northwest Africa, who had been raiding the Roman towns of Mauritania. Having defeated them and driven them back into their hills, he took ship for Ephesus. After wintering there, he visited the cities of Asia Minor, listening to petitions and complaints, punishing malfeasance, rewarding competence, and providing money, designs, and workmen for municipal temples, baths, and theaters. Cyzicus, Nicaea, and Nicomedia had suffered a severe earthquake. Hadrian had the damage made good by imperial funds and built at Cyzicus a temple that was at once ranked among the 7 wonders of the world. He pushed eastward along the Euxine to Trapezus, ordered the governor of Cappadocia, the historian Arrian, to examine and report to him the condition of all the ports on the Black Sea, moved southwest through Paphlagonia, and spent a winter at Pergamum. In the fall of 125 he sailed to Rhodes and thence to Athens. He passed a happy winter there and then turned homeward. Still curious, at 50, he stopped in Sicily and climbed Mount Etna to see the sunrise from a perch 11,000 feet above the sea. It is worthy of note that he could leave his capital for 5 years and trust to his subordinates to carry on. Like a good manager, he had organized and trained an almost automatic government. He stayed in Rome something more than a year, but the lust for travel was in his blood, and so much of the world remained to rebuild. In 128 he set out again, this time to Utica, Carthage, and the flourishing new cities of northern Africa. Returning to Rome in the fall, he left soon afterward and spent another winter in Athens, from 128 to 129. He was made archon, presided happily at games and festivals, and enjoyed being called liberator, Helios, Zeus, and savior of the world. He mingled with philosophers and artists, imitating the graces without the follies of Nero and Antony. Distressed by the free chaos of Athens's laws, he commissioned a corps of jurists to codify them. Always skeptically interested in religion, he had himself initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Finding Athens beset with unemployment and resolved to restore the city to the splendor of Periclean days, he summoned architects, engineers, and skilled artisans, and began a building program more extensive than his public works in Rome. In a square enclosed by an extensive colonnade, his workmen raised a library with marble walls, 120 columns, a gilded roof, and spacious rooms sparkling with alabaster paintings and statuary. They built a gymnasium, an aqueduct, a temple to Hera, and another to Zeus Panhellenikos, god of all the Greeks. The most ambitious of these architectural undertakings was the completion in 131 of the Olympium, that lordly temple to Zeus the Olympian which Pisistratus had begun 6 centuries before, and Antiochus Epiphanes had failed to finish. When Hadrian left Athens, it was a cleaner, more prosperous, and more beautiful city than ever before in its history. In the spring of 129, he sailed to Ephesus and traveled again in Asia Minor, spawning buildings and cities as he went. He sallied into Cappadocia and reviewed the garrisons there. At Antioch, he provided funds for an aqueduct, a temple, a theater, and public baths. In the fall, he visited Palmyra and Arabia, and in 130 he journeyed to Jerusalem. The holy city was still in ruins, almost as Titus had left it 60 years before. A handful of destitute Jews lived in lairs and hovels amid the rocks. Hadrian's heart was touched by the desolation, and his imagination was moved by the empty site. He had hoped, by his restoration of Greece and the Hellenistic East, to raise higher than before the barriers between Greco-Roman civilization and the Oriental world. Now he dreamed of transforming Zion itself into a pagan citadel. He ordered that Jerusalem should be rebuilt as a Roman colony and renamed Aelia Capitolina in memory of Hadrian's gens and Jupiter's capital in Rome. It was an astonishing error of psychology and statesmanship in one of the wisest statesmen in history. He passed on to Alexandria in 130, smiled tolerantly at its disputatious populace, enriched the museum, rebuilt Pompey's tomb, and then, surpassing Caesar, abandoned himself to a leisurely sail up the Nile with his wife Sabina and his beloved Antinous. He had come upon the young Greek some years before in Bithynia. He had been stirred by the youth's rounded beauty, soft eyes, and curly head. He had made him his favored page and had formed for him a tender and passionate attachment. Sabina made no protest that has come down to us, but the gossip of the cities assumed that the boy played Ganymede to the new Zeus. Possibly, however, the childless emperor loved him as a heaven-sent son. Now, at the height of Hadrian's happiness, Antinous, still but 18, died, apparently by drowning in the Nile. The monarch of the world wept like a woman, says Spartianus. He ordered a temple to be raised on the shore, buried the lad there, and offered him to the world as a god. Around the shrine he built a city, Antinopolis, destined to be a Byzantine capital. While Hadrian returned sadly to Rome, legend began to remold the story. The emperor, it said, had learned by magic divination that his greatest plans would succeed only if that which he loved most should die. Antinous had heard of the prophecy and had gone voluntarily to his death. Perhaps the legend formed soon enough to embitter Hadrian's declining years. Back in Rome in 131 he could feel that he had made the empire better than he had found it. Never before, not even under Augustus, had it been so prosperous, and never has the Mediterranean world reached that fullness of life again. Never has it again been the home of so advanced a civilization, so widely spread and so deeply shared. And no man had so beneficently ruled it as Hadrian. Augustus had thought of the provinces as a lucrative appendage to Italy, to be husbanded for Italy's sake. Now for the first time the ideas of Caesar and Claudius reached fulfillment, and Rome became not a tax collector for Italy, but the responsible administrator of a realm in which all parts alike received the care of the government, and in which the Greek spirit ruled the East and the mind as openly as the Roman spirit ruled the state and the West. Hadrian had seen it all and had made it one. He had promised that he would manage the Commonwealth as conscious that it was the people's property, not his own. And he had kept his promise. 3. The Builder. Only one thing remained, to make Rome too more beautiful than before. The artist in Hadrian was ever competing with the governor. He rebuilt the Pantheon while reorganizing Roman law. No other man ever built so plentifully, no other ruler so directly. The structures erected for him were sometimes designed by him, and were always subject to his expert inspection as they progressed. He had 100 edifices repaired or restored, and inscribed his name on none of them. Rome in all quarters benefited from his rare union of wisdom with power. Si jeunesse savait et vieillesse pouvait, if youth knew and old age could, was in him a riddle solved. His most famous reconstruction was the Pantheon, the best preserved building of the ancient world. The rectangular temple reared by Agrippa had been destroyed by fire. Apparently only the frontal Corinthian portico remained. North of this remnant, Hadrian had his architects and engineers raise a circular temple in the most indigenous of Roman styles. His Hellenic tastes inclined him to prefer Greek to Roman forms in the architecture of his capital. The new temple did not form with the portico a harmonious whole, but the interior, a circle 132 feet in diameter with no impeding supports, gave a sense of space and freedom equaled only by the Gothic cathedrals. The walls were 20 feet thick, of brick externally faced in the lower section with marble, in the rest with stucco relieved by pilasters. The ceiling of the portico was of bronze plates so thick that when they were removed by Pope Urban VIII they sufficed to cast 110 cannon and to form the baldachin over the high altar in St. Peter's. The massive bronze doors were originally covered with gold. 7 niches were cut into the lower section of the windowless interior wall, and were adorned with lofty marble columns and entablatures. Once these niches served as alcoves for statuary, now they are modest chapels in a magnificent church. A higher section of the wall was plated with panels of costly stone, separated by pillars of porphyry. The coffered dome, rising inward from the top of the walls, was the supreme triumph of Roman engineering. It was erected by pouring concrete into ribbed sections and letting the whole congeal into one solid mass. Its monolithic character did away with lateral thrust, but to make security doubly sure, the architect built buttresses into the walls. At the top of the dome, an opening, the oculus, or eye, 26 feet in diameter, gave the interior its sole and sufficient illumination. From this majestic dome, the largest in history, an architectural lineage descends through Byzantine and Romanesque variations to the Dome of St. Peter's and to that of the Capitol in Washington. Probably Hadrian himself designed the double-apsed temple to Venus and Roma, which rose opposite the Colosseum, for legend tells how he sent his plans for it to Apollodorus and had the old architect put to death for returning a scornful comment. The temple was notable in several particulars. It was the largest in Rome. It had 2 cellas, one for each of its gods, who sat back-to-back on incommunicative thrones, and its vaulted roof of gold-plated bronze tiles was among the most brilliant sights of the city. For himself, the emperor built a yet ampler home, the villa whose remains still draw visitors to the pleasant suburb known to him as Tiber, to us as Tivoli. There, in an estate 7 miles in circumference, rose a palace with every variety of room, and gardens so crowded with famous works of art that every major museum in Europe has enriched itself from the ruins. The designer showed here the usual Roman indifference to symmetry. He added building to building as need or fancy prompted, and made no greater attempt at harmony than we find in the architectural chaos of the Forum. Perhaps the Romans, like the Japanese, were tired of symmetry and pleased with the surprises of irregularity. Besides porticos, libraries, temples, a theater, a music hall, and a hippodrome, the profuse architect added small replicas of Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and Zeno's Stoa, as if the emperor, amid all this vain wealth, would make some amends to philosophy. The villa was finished in the last years of Hadrian's life. We do not know that he found happiness there. The revolt of the Jews in 135 embittered him. He put it down without mercy and fretted that he could not end his reign without war. In that same year, still only 59, he was stricken with a painful and wasting illness, akin to tuberculosis and dropsy, which slowly crushed his body, his spirit, and his mind. His temper became sharper, his manner querulous. He suspected his oldest friends of conspiring to kill and replace him. At last, perhaps in an illucid interval, and how justly we cannot say, he ordered that several of them should be put to death. To end the war of succession that was forming in his court, he adopted as heir his friend Lucius Verus. When, soon after, Lucius died, Hadrian called to his bedside at Tiber a man with an unblemished reputation for integrity and wisdom, Titus Aurelius Antoninus, and adopted him as his son and successor. Looking far ahead, he advised Antoninus to adopt in turn and educate for government 2 youths then growing up at the court, Marcus Annius Verus, then 17, and Lucius Aelius Verus, then 11, respectively the nephew of Antoninus and the son of Lucius Verus. The title of Caesar, heretofore borne by the emperors and their agnatic descendants, was conferred by Hadrian upon Antoninus, and thereafter, while the emperors kept for themselves the title of Augustus, they granted the name Caesar to each heir presumptive to the throne. Hadrian's sickness and sufferings had now increased. Blood often gushed from his nostrils, and in his distress he began to long for death. He had already prepared his own tomb beyond the Tiber, that huge mausoleum whose gloomy remains are today the Castel Sant'Angelo, still reached by the Pons Ilius that Hadrian built. He was impressed by the example of the Stoic philosopher Euphrates, then in Rome, who, weary with illness and old age, asked Hadrian's permission to kill himself, and, receiving it, drank hemlock. The emperor begged for poison or a sword, but no attendant would accommodate him. He bade a Danubian slave stab him, but the slave fled. He commanded his physician to poison him, but the physician committed suicide. He found a dagger and was about to kill himself when it was taken from him. He mourned that he who had the power to put anyone to death was not himself permitted to die. Dismissing his doctors, he withdrew to Baiae and deliberately fed on foods and drinks that would hasten his end. At last, exhausted and maddened with pain, he died in 138 after 62 years of life and 21 of rule. He left behind him a little poem that expressed like Dante the sadness of recalling in grief the days of our happiness. Soul of mine, pretty one, flitting one, guest and partner of my clay, whither wilt thou hie away? Pallid one, rigid one, naked one, never to play again, never to play. 4. Antoninus Pius. Of Antoninus there is no history, for he had almost no faults and committed no crimes. His ancestors had come from Nîmes 2 generations before, and his family was one of the wealthiest in Rome. Reaching the throne at 51, he gave the empire the most equitable and not the least efficient government it would ever have. He was the most fortunate man that ever wore a crown. We are told that he was tall and handsome, healthy and serene, gentle and resolute, modest and omnipotent, eloquent and a despiser of rhetoric, popular and immune to flattery. If we are to believe his adopted son Marcus, we should have to reject him as that faultless monster whom the world ne'er knew. The Senate called him Pius as a model of the milder Roman virtues, and Optimus Princeps as the best of princes. He had no enemies and hundreds of friends, but he was not unacquainted with grief. His elder daughter died as he was setting out as proconsul to Asia. His younger daughter proved a dubious wife to Aurelius, and scandal accused his own wife of being as faithless as she was beautiful. Antoninus bore these rumors silently, and after Faustina's death he established in her name and honor a fund for the support and education of girls, and raised to her memory one of the loveliest temples in the Forum. He did not marry again, lest he mar the happiness and inheritance of his children, but contented himself with a concubine. He was not a man of intellect in the narrower sense of that term. He had no learning, and looked with an aristocrat's indulgence upon men of letters, philosophy, or art. Nevertheless, he helped such men richly, and invited them often to his home. He preferred religion to philosophy, worshipped the old gods with apparent sincerity, and gave his adopted sons an example of piety that Marcus never forgot. "Do everything as a disciple of Antoninus," Marcus bade himself. "Remember his constancy in every reasonable act, his evenness in all things, his piety, and the serenity of his countenance, and his disregard of empty fame. With how little he was satisfied, how laborious and patient, how religious without superstition." Yet he was tolerant of non-Roman creeds, moderated Hadrian's measures against the Jews, and continued his predecessor's lenience toward the Christians. He was no killjoy. He loved a jest and made many a good one. He played, fished, and hunted with his friends, and from his behavior none could have guessed that he was emperor. He preferred the quiet of his villa at Lanuvium to the luxury of his official palace, and nearly always spent the evenings in the intimacy of his family. When he inherited the throne, he put aside all thought of that careless ease to which he had looked forward as the consolation of old age. Perceiving that his wife anticipated increased splendor, he reproved her. "Do you not understand that we have now lost what we had before?" He knew that he had succeeded to the cares of the world. He began his reign by pouring his immense personal fortune into the imperial treasury. He cancelled arrears of taxes, made gifts of money to the citizens, paid for many festival games, and relieved scarcities of wine, oil, and wheat by buying these and distributing them free. He carried on, but with moderation, the building program of Hadrian in Italy and the provinces. Yet he managed the national finances so ably that at his death the combined treasuries of the state had 2,700,000,000 sesterces. He gave a public accounting of all his receipts and expenditures. He behaved toward the Senate as merely one of it, and never took important measures without consulting its leaders. He devoted himself to the chores of administration as well as to the problems of policy. He cared for all men and all things as his own. He continued Hadrian's liberalization of the law, equalized the penalties of adultery for men and women, deprived ruthless masters of their slaves, restricted the torture of slaves in trials, and decreed severe punishment for any owner who killed a slave. He encouraged education with state funds, provided for the education of poor children, and extended to recognized teachers and philosophers many privileges of the senatorial class. He ruled the provinces as well as he could without traveling. In all his long reign he was never absent for a day from Rome or its environs. He was content to appoint to provincial governorships men of tried competence and honor. He was anxious to keep the empire safe without war. He was continually quoting the saying of Scipio that he would rather save a single citizen than slay 1,000 foes. He had to wage some minor wars in order to suppress revolts in Dacia, Achaia, and Egypt, but he left these tasks to subordinates and was satisfied with Hadrian's cautious frontiers. Some tribes in Germany interpreted his mildness as weakness, and perhaps were encouraged by it to prepare those invasions which rocked the empire after his death. This is the one flaw in his statesmanship. For the rest of the provinces were happy under him and accepted the empire as the only alternative to chaos and strife. They showered him with petitions, which he almost always granted, and they could rely upon him to repair the ravages of any public calamity. Provincial authors, Strabo, Philo, Plutarch, Appian, Epictetus, Aelius Aristides, sang the praises of the Pax Romana. And Appian assures us that he had seen at Rome the envoys of foreign states vainly asking admission for their countries to the boons of the Roman yoke. Never had monarchy left men so free, or so respected the rights of its subjects. The world's ideal seemed to have been attained. Wisdom reigned, and for 23 years the world was governed by a father. It only remained for Antoninus to crown a good life with a peaceful death. In his 74th year he fell sick of a stomach disturbance and was seized with a high fever. He called Marcus Aurelius to his bedside and committed to him the care of the state. He instructed his servants to transfer to Marcus's room the golden statue of Fortuna that had for many years stood in the bedchamber of the prince. To the officer of the day he gave as watchword Equanimitas. Soon afterward he turned as if to sleep and died, this in 161. All classes and cities vied with one another in honoring his memory. 5. The philosopher as emperor. Antoninus, said Renaud, would have been without competition for the reputation of being the best of sovereigns had he not designated Marcus Aurelius as his heir. If, said Gibbon, a man were called upon to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the accession of Nerva to the death of Aurelius. Their united reigns are possibly the only period of history in which the happiness of a great people was the sole object of government. Marcus Annius Verus was born in Rome in 121. The Annii had come a century before from Succubo, near Cordova. There, it seems, their honesty had won them the cognomen Verus, true. 3 months after the boy's birth his father died, and he was taken into the home of his rich grandfather, then consul. Hadrian was a frequent visitor there. He took a fancy to the boy and saw in him the stuff of kings. Seldom has any lad had so propitious a youth or so keenly appreciated his good fortune. To the gods, he wrote 50 years later, I am indebted for having good grandparents, good parents, a good sister, good teachers, good kinsmen and friends, nearly everything good. Time struck a balance by giving him a questionable wife and a worthless son. His meditations list the virtues these people had, and the lessons he received from them in modesty, patience, manliness, abstemiousness, piety, benevolence, and a simplicity of life far removed from the habits of the rich, though wealth surrounded him on every side. Never was a boy so persistently educated. He was attached in boyhood to the service of temples and priests. He committed to memory every word of the ancient and unintelligible liturgy, and though philosophy later shook his faith, it never diminished his sedulous performance of the old exacting ritual. Marcus liked games and sports, even bird snaring and hunting, and some efforts were made to train his body as well as his mind and character. But 17 tutors in childhood are a heavy handicap. 4 grammarians, 4 rhetors, 1 jurist, and 8 philosophers divided his soul among them. The most famous of these teachers was M. Cornelius Fronto, who taught him rhetoric. Though Marcus loved him, lavished upon him all the kindnesses of an affectionate and royal pupil, and exchanged with him letters of intimate charm, the youth turned his back upon oratory as a vain and dishonest art, and abandoned himself to philosophy. He thanks his instructors for sparing him logic and astrology, thanks Diognetus the Stoic for freeing him from superstition, Junius Rusticus for acquainting him with Epictetus, and Sextus of Chaeronea for teaching him to live in conformity with nature. He is grateful to his brother Severus for telling him about Brutus, Cato of Utica, Thrasea, and Helvidius. From him I received the idea of a state in which there is the same law for all, a polity of equal rights and freedom of speech, and the idea of a kingly government that most of all respects the freedom of the governed. Here the Stoic ideal of monarchy takes possession of the throne. He thanks Maximus for teaching him self-government, and not to be led aside by anything, cheerfulness in all circumstances, and a just admixture of gentleness and dignity, and to do appointed tasks without complaining. It is clear that the leading philosophers of the time were priests without religion, rather than metaphysicians without life. Marcus took them so seriously that for a time he almost ruined a naturally weak constitution with ascetic devotions. At the age of 12 he took on the rude cloak of a philosopher, slept on a little straw strewn over the floor, and long resisted the entreaties of his mother to use a couch. He was a Stoic before he became a man. He offers thanks that I preserved the flower of my youth, that I took not upon me to be a man before my time, but rather put it off longer than I needed, that I never had to do with Benedicta, and afterwards when I fell into some fits of love I was soon cured. 2 influences diverted him from professional philosophy and sanctity. One was the succession of minor political offices to which he was appointed. The realism of an administrator was crossed with the idealism of a meditative youth. The other was his close association with Antoninus Pius. He did not fret at Antoninus's longevity, but continued his life of Stoic simplicity, philosophical study, and official duties. while living in the palace and serving his protracted apprenticeship. And the example of his adoptive father's devotion and honesty in government became a powerful influence in his development. The name by which we know him, Aurelius, was the clan name of Antoninus, which both Marcus and Lucius, on their adoption, had taken as their own. Lucius became a gay man of the world, a graceful adept in the pleasures of life. When in 146 Pius desired a colleague to share the government with him, he named Marcus only and left to Lucius the empire of love. On the death of Antoninus, Marcus became sole emperor, but remembering Hadrian's wish, he at once made Lucius Verus his full colleague and gave him his daughter Lucilla in marriage. At the outset of his reign, as at the end, the philosopher erred through kindness. The division of rule was a bad precedent, which in the heirs of Diocletian and Constantine would divide and weaken the realm. Marcus asked the Senate to vote Pius divine honors, completed with perfect taste the temple that Pius had raised to his wife, and rededicated it to Antoninus and Faustina both. He paid the state every courtesy and rejoiced to see that many of his philosopher friends had found their way into its membership. All Italy and the provinces claimed him as Plato's dream come true. The philosopher was king. But he had no thought of attempting a utopia. Like Antoninus, he was a conservative. Radicals do not grow up in palaces. He was a philosopher-king in the Stoic rather than the Platonic sense. Never hope, he admonished himself, to realize Plato's republic. Let it be sufficient that you have in some degree ameliorated mankind, and do not think such improvement a matter of small importance. Who can change the opinions of men? And without a change of sentiments, what can you make but reluctant slaves and hypocrites? He had discovered that not all men wished to be saints, and he sadly reconciled himself to a world of corruption and wickedness. The immortal gods consent for countless ages to endure without anger, and even to surround with blessings so many and such evil men. But thou, who hast so short a time to live, art thou already weary? He decided to rely on example rather than law. He made himself, in fact, a public servant. He carried all the burdens of administration and judgment, even that part which Lucius had agreed to take but was neglecting. He allowed himself no luxury, treated all men with simple fellowship, and wore himself out by being easy of access. He was not a great statesman. He spent too much of the public funds in cash gifts to the people and the army, gave each member of the Praetorian Guard 20,000 sesterces, increased the number of those who could apply for free corn, provided frequent and costly games, and remitted large sums in unpaid taxes and tribute. It was generosity with many precedents, but unwise at a time when rebellion or war visibly threatened, or was breaking out, in several provinces and on far-spread frontiers. Marcus continued sedulously that reform of law which Hadrian had begun. He increased the number of court days and reduced the length of trials. He himself often sat as judge, inflexible against grave offenses, but usually merciful. He devised legal protection for wards against dishonest guardians, for debtors against creditors, for provinces against governors. He connived at the rejuvenation of the forbidden collegia, legalized those associations which were chiefly burial societies, made them legal persons eligible for bequests, and established a fund for the interment of poor citizens. He gave the alimenta the widest extension in their history. After the death of his wife, he created an endowment for the aid of young women. A pretty bas-relief shows us such girls crowding around the younger Faustina, who pours wheat into their laps. He abolished mixed bathing, forbade extravagant remuneration to actors and gladiators, restricted according to their wealth the expenditures of the cities on games, required the use of foiled weapons in gladiatorial contests, and did all that sanguinary custom would allow to banish death from the arena. The people loved him, but not his laws. When he enlisted gladiators from his army for the Marcomannic Wars, the populace cried out in good-humored anger, "He is taking our amusement from us. He wants to force us to be philosophers." Rome was preparing, but not quite ready, to be Puritan. It was his misfortune that his fame as a philosopher, and the long peace under Hadrian and Antoninus, encouraged rebels within and barbarians without. In 162, revolt broke out in Britain, the Chatti invaded Roman Germany, and the Parthian king Vologases III declared war upon Rome. Marcus chose able generals to put down the revolt in the north, but he delegated to Lucius Verus the major task of fighting Parthia. Lucius got no farther than Antioch, for there lived Pantheon, so beautiful and accomplished that Lucian thought all the perfections of all sculptural masterpieces had come together in her, to which were added a voice of intoxicating melody, fingers skilled on the lyre, and a mind enriched with literature and philosophy. Lucius saw her and, like Gilgamesh, forgot when he was born. He abandoned himself to pleasure, to hunting, at last to debauchery, while the Parthians rode into terror-stricken Syria. Marcus made no comment on Lucius, but sent to Avidius Cassius, second in charge in Lucius's army, a plan of campaign whose military excellence helped the general's own ability not only to drive the Parthians back across Mesopotamia, but to plant the Roman standards once more in Seleucia and Tisiphon. This time the two cities were burned to the ground, lest they serve again as bases for Parthian campaigns. Lucius returned from Antioch to Rome and was awarded a triumph, which he magnanimously insisted that Marcus should share. Lucius brought with him the invisible victor of the war, pestilence. It had appeared first among the troops of Avidius in captured Seleucia. It spread so rapidly that he withdrew his army into Mesopotamia, while the Parthians rejoiced at the vengeance of their gods. The retreating legions carried the plague with them to Syria. Lucius took some of these soldiers to Rome to march in his triumph. They infected every city through which they passed and every region of the empire to which they were later assigned. The ancient historians tell us more of its ravages than of its nature. Their descriptions suggest exanthematous typhus, or possibly bubonic plague. Galen thought it similar to the disease that had wasted the Athenians under Pericles. In both cases, black pustules almost covered the body, the victim was racked with a hoarse cough, and his breath stank. Rapidly it swept through Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Italy, and Gaul. Within a year, from 166 to 167, it had killed more men than had been lost in the war. In Rome, 2,000 died of it in one day, including many of the aristocracy. Corpses were carried out of the city in heaps. Marcus, helpless before this intangible enemy, did all he could to mitigate the evil. But the medical science of his day could offer him no guidance, and the epidemic ran its course until it had established an immunity or had killed all its carriers. The effects were endless. Many localities were so despoiled of population that they reverted to jungle or desert. Food production fell, transport was disorganized, floods destroyed great quantities of grain, and famine succeeded plague. The happy hilaritas that had marked the beginning of Marcus's reign vanished. Men yielded to a bewildered pessimism, flocked to soothsayers and oracles, clouded the altars with incense and sacrifice, and sought consolation where alone it was offered them, in the new religions of personal immortality and heavenly peace. Amid these domestic difficulties came news in 167 that the tribes along the Danube, Chatti, Quadi, Marcomanni, Yazyges, had crossed the river, overwhelmed a Roman garrison of 20,000 men, and were pouring unhindered into Dacia, Rhaetia, Pannonia, Noricum. That some had made their way over the Alps, had defeated every army sent against them, were besieging Aquileia, near Venice, were threatening Verona, and were laying waste the rich fields of northern Italy. Never before had the German tribes moved with such unity or so closely threatened Rome. Marcus acted with surprising decisiveness. He put away the pleasures of philosophy and determined to take the field in what he foresaw would be the most momentous of Roman wars since Hannibal. He shocked Italy by enrolling policemen, gladiators, slaves, brigands, and barbarous mercenaries into legions depleted by war and pestilence. Even the gods were conscripted to his purpose. He bade the priests of alien faiths to offer sacrifice for Rome according to their various rites. And he himself burned such hecatombs at the altars that a wit circulated a message sent him by white oxen, begging him not to be too victorious. "If thou shouldst conquer, we are lost." To raise war funds without levying special taxes, he auctioned off in the Forum the wardrobes, art objects, and jewels of the imperial palaces. He took careful measures of defense, fortified the border towns from Gaul to the Aegean, blocked the passes into Italy, and bribed German and Scythian tribes to attack the invaders in the rear. With energy and courage, all the more admirable in a man who hated war, he trained his army into disciplined strength, led them through a hard campaign mapped out with strategic skill, drove the besiegers from Aquileia, routed them even to the Danube until nearly all were captured or dead. He understood that this action had not ended the German danger, but thinking the situation safe for a time, he returned with his colleague to Rome. On the way, Lucius died of an apoplectic stroke, and gossip, which like politics has no bowels of mercy, whispered that Marcus had poisoned him. From January to September 169, the emperor rested at home from efforts that had strained his frail body close to the breaking point. He suffered from a stomach ailment that often left him too weak to talk. He controlled it by eating sparingly, one light meal a day. Those who knew his condition and his diet marveled at his labors in the palace and the field, and could only say that he made up in resolution what he lacked in strength. On several occasions he called in the most famous physician of the age, Galen of Pergamum, and praised him for the unpretentious remedies he prescribed. Perhaps a succession of domestic disappointments cooperated with political and military crises to aggravate his illness and make him old at 48. His wife, Faustina, whose pretty face has come down to us in many a sculptured portrait, may not have relished sharing bed and board with incarnate philosophy. She was a lively creature who longed for a gayer life than his sober nature could give her. The talk of the town assumed her infidelity. The mimes satirized him as a cuckold and even named his rivals. Like Antoninus with Faustina the mother, Marcus said nothing. Instead, he promoted the supposed paramours to high office, gave Faustina every sign of tenderness and respect, had her deified when she died in 175, and thanked the gods in his meditations for so obedient and affectionate a wife. No evidence exists upon which to condemn her. Of the 4 children that she gave him, and whom he loved with a passion still warm in his letters to Fronto, 1 girl died in childhood. The surviving daughter was saddened by Lucius's life and widowed by his death. Twin sons came in 161. One died at birth, the other was Commodus. Scandalmongers called him a gladiator's gift to Faustina, and he strove all his life long to confirm the tale. But he was a handsome and vigorous lad. Marcus forgivably doted on him, presented him to the legions in a manner symbolic of naming a successor, and engaged the best teachers in Rome to fit him for rule. The youth preferred to model cups, dance, sing, hunt, and fence. He developed an understandable aversion to books, scholars, and philosophers, but enjoyed the company of gladiators and athletes. Soon he surpassed all comrades in lying, cruelty, and coarse speech. Marcus was too good to be great enough to discipline him or renounce him. He kept on hoping that education and responsibility would sober him and make him grow into a king. The lonely emperor, emaciated, beard untended, eyes weary with anxiety and sleeplessness, turned back from his wife and son to the tasks of government and war. The assaults of the Central European tribes against the frontier had stopped only for a breathing spell. In this struggle to destroy an empire and make barbarism free, peace was but an armistice. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.